The penthouse suite at the Sterling Hotel had never felt colder. Oliver's heart stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights of Ashford blur below him. The glass was cool against his forehead, a small comfort against the burning knot in his chest that had been tightening for weeks now. Behind him, he could hear the soft rustle of expensive silk and the clink of a champagne flute being set down on the marble table. The scent of cedar and sandalwood hung in the air, muted by suppressants but still achingly familiar. That particular blend of wealth and arrogance that had once made Oliver feel like he'd finally found where he belonged. "Oliver, we need to talk." He turned slowly. Elliot Moreau looked flawless, as always. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his tailored charcoal suit hugging broad shoulders that had once been the only place Oliver ever wanted to rest his head. The alpha's scent was carefully controlled, but Oliver had known him long enough to detect the underlying tension in the set of his jaw, the way his fingers curled just slightly against his palm. 3 years of intimacy had taught Oliver to read Elliot's body language better than anyone, and right now, every signal was screaming that something was about to shatter. "I know what you're going to say," Oliver said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. The Omega in him wanted to cross the room, to press himself against the alpha and demand to know what was wrong. But he'd learned long ago that his instincts didn't matter when Elliot had already made up his mind. "I've known for weeks. You've been pulling away." The phone calls stopped coming first, then the dinners. "You stopped looking at me like I mattered." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Then why are you making this harder than it needs to be?" "Because I thought we had something real." Oliver pushed off from the window, taking a step closer, then stopping himself. The distance between them felt like miles. 3 years, Elliot. 3 years of waking up next to you. 3 years of building something together, of planning a future. And now you're telling me it was all what? A mistake? A phase? Don't. Elliot's voice cracked slightly. Don't make this about blame. It's not about blame. Then what is it about? Oliver demanded, and there was an edge of desperation in his voice now, the Omega in him fighting against the rejection that was coming. He could feel it in the air between them, could smell the faint sour note of guilt beneath Elliot's carefully suppressed scent. "Tell me the truth. I deserve that much." Elliot turned away, moving toward the table where a crystal decanter sat gleaming. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his movements precise and controlled, a mask of composure that Oliver knew was just that, a mask. When he spoke, his voice was deliberately flat. "My father had a meeting with the board last week. The Moreau shipping empire is in trouble, has been for years, actually. The old money dried up faster than anyone expected, and we've been hemorrhaging capital for the better part of a decade. My father's been hiding it, trying to patch things together with loans and goodwill, but it's not enough. It was never going to be enough." Oliver frowned. "What does that have to do with us?" Elliot laughed, a hollow sound that made Oliver's chest ache. "Everything, Oliver. It has everything to do with us. My father needs a merger, a partnership with someone who can shore up the family's finances. Someone with enough capital to keep us afloat while we restructure." He finally turned to face Oliver, and there were tears in his eyes, tears he was fighting to keep from falling. "Damien Sterling has agreed to invest $2 billion in exchange for a marriage alliance. The engagement was announced this morning." The words hit Oliver like a physical blow. He felt his knees go weak, felt the blood drain from his face. "You're engaged? To Damien Sterling?" "I'm saving my family," Elliot said, and his voice broke on the last word. "I'm doing what I have to do. I don't have a choice, Oliver. If I don't do this, everything my father built, everything my grandfather built, it all disappears. Thousands of employees lose their jobs. Generations of history, gone." "Bullshit." The word came out harsher than Oliver intended, but he couldn't stop it. "There's always a choice. You're just choosing the easy one. The one where you don't have to fight for what we had. You think this is easy?" Elliot's composure finally cracked, his alpha scent flooding the room. Anguish and desperation, and something that smelled almost like grief. "You think I wanted this? I've been crying myself to sleep for weeks, Oliver. I've been trying to find any way out, any loophole, any miracle that would let me keep you and still do what my family needs. There isn't one. There never was. I would have helped you. Oliver stepped closer, his voice pleading now. I would have done anything. I could have. Could have what? Elliot cut him off, bitter and broken. You're a trauma surgeon, Oliver. A brilliant one, the best I've ever met. But you don't have $2 billion. You don't have connections that could save my family's legacy. You have yourself, which is wonderful, and more than I deserve, but it's not enough. It's never going to be enough. Oliver felt something splinter inside his chest. So that's it. 3 years, and I get nothing. I'm giving you something. Elliot moved to the table, picking up a check that Oliver hadn't noticed before. $2 million. It's the most I could access without my father knowing. Take it. Start over somewhere new. Build a life for yourself that doesn't include me dragging you down. Oliver stared at the check. $2 million. More money than his mother had made in her entire lifetime working at the hospital cafeteria. More money than he'd see in a decade of surgeries. The Omega in him recoiled from it, from the implication that his love could be bought off so easily. You think this makes it better? Oliver laughed, and it came out broken. You think I want your family's money? I wanted you. I wanted the man who used to stay up all night talking to me about nothing. The man who held me when I had nightmares about losing patience. The man who looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I still look at you that way. Elliot's voice was barely a whisper. I'll always look at you that way. But I can't be what you deserve, Oliver. I can't give you the life you should have. My world is poison. It's all appearances and obligations and impossible expectations. Do you really want that? Do you really want to spend the rest of your life pretending to be something you're not? I'd do anything for you. Oliver's voice was thick with emotion. I'd spend every day proving myself. I don't care about your world or your money or any of it. I just care about you. Then take the check. Elliot stepped closer, and for a moment, his scent broke through the suppressants completely. Warm and familiar, the scent that had always made Oliver feel like he was home. Take the money and build something beautiful with it. Marry someone who can give you everything you deserve without having to fight for it every single day. Someone who doesn't come with a family that will never accept you. I don't want someone else. Oliver reached out, his hand hovering over Elliot's arm, not quite touching. I want you. I know. Elliot's voice cracked again, and a single tear escaped down his cheek. That's what makes this so hard. I love you, Oliver. I've loved you since the moment we met at that stupid gala, and you wrapped my ankle and argued with me about proper first aid technique. I've loved you every single day since then. But love isn't enough. It's never enough. And I'm so sorry that I have to be the one to teach you that. Oliver felt the tears burning behind his eyes. He'd never cried in front of anyone. Not as a child. Not during medical school. Not when he'd lost patients who'd been under his care. But right now, standing in this cold hotel room with the man he loved telling him goodbye, he couldn't hold them back. Please, he said, and he hated how broken his voice sounded. Please don't do this. We can figure something out. We always have before. No. Elliot shook his head, stepping back, putting distance between them again. No, we can't. I've already signed the agreement with Damien. The engagement is public. It's done, Oliver. And I need you to accept that, because if you don't, if you make me watch you fight for something that's already gone, I will break. I will absolutely break, and I can't afford that. My family needs me strong. Your family needs you to be a puppet, Oliver said bitterly. A breeding stud for the sterling fortune. The insult hit its mark. Elliot flinched, his face going pale. That's not, isn't it? Oliver pressed on, the hurt and anger finally finding an outlet. They're selling you to the highest bidder, and you're going along with it. The man I loved would have fought back. The man I loved would have told his father to go to hell. But you're not him anymore, are you? You're just a pretty alpha who does what he's told. Stop. Elliot's voice was shaking. Stop, Oliver. You don't understand what you're saying. Then explain it to me. Oliver crossed the distance between them, taking Elliot's face in his hands, forcing the alpha to meet his eyes. Explain to me why you're throwing us away. Explain to me why you can't fight for what we have. I'm right here. I'm still fighting. I'll always be fighting. But I need you to meet me halfway, Elliot. I need you to want this as much as I do." Elliot's eyes glistened, and for a moment, Oliver thought he saw the old Elliot, the one who'd laughed freely and loved openly and never let anyone tell him who to be. Then the mask slid back into place, and the alpha gently pulled away. "I'm sorry," Elliot said, his voice steady now, controlled. "I'm so sorry, Oliver. But I made my decision, and I need you to respect it." Oliver dropped his hands, feeling the last thread of hope snap. "So that's it. That's the end. Take the check." Elliot picked it up and pressed it into Oliver's hands. "Go home. Take some time off. Heal. And when you're ready, find someone who can give you what I can't. I want you to be happy, Oliver. Even if it's with someone else." Oliver stared at the check in his hands, then looked up at the man he'd thought he'd spend his life with. "I'll never be happy with someone else," he said quietly, "because I'll always be comparing them to you, and they'll always come up short." Elliot's composure finally cracked, and he let out a small, broken sound that was almost a sob. "Please don't make this harder. Please just go." Oliver nodded slowly. He folded the check and put it in his pocket, not because he wanted it, but because Elliot had always been the kind of man who needed things to be tidy. If taking the money made this easier for Elliot, Oliver could do that. He'd take the humiliation along with everything else. He turned and walked toward the door. Each step felt like walking through deep water, every movement requiring effort he didn't have. His hand was on the handle when Elliot's voice stopped him. "Oliver." He paused, not turning around. "I love you," Elliot said, his voice barely audible. "I will always love you. Please remember that. Please don't hate me." Oliver closed his eyes, feeling the tears slide down his cheeks. "I could never hate you," he said. "That's the worst part." He walked out the door and didn't look back. The Sterling Hotel's grand lobby was a cathedral of marble and crystal, filled with Ashford's elite enjoying their Friday evening cocktails. Oliver walked through it like a ghost, his expensive suit, bought specifically for the engagement announcement that would never happen, feeling like a costume he'd never meant to wear. His Omega scent was spiking with distress, and he could feel the stares of the other patrons as they tracked him through the lobby. He must look like a disaster, he realized dimly. His eyes were red-rimmed, his composure shattered, his entire body radiating the kind of brokenness that made people uncomfortable. Oliver Hart. Well. He stopped. Sebastian Vance, Elliot's closest friend since childhood, was approaching with a predatory smile. The alpha was handsome in a polished, corporate way, perfect hair, perfectly tailored suit, perfectly smug expression. His scent was sharp and aggressive, the kind of power play pheromones that lesser alphas use to try to establish dominance. Sebastian's family had been trying to arrange a match between him and Elliot for years, and Elliot's rejection of him in favor of Oliver had been a public humiliation that Sebastian had never forgiven. "Sebastian," Oliver said flatly. "Not now." "Oh, I think now is exactly the right time." Sebastian fell into step beside him, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. "I heard Elliot finally came to his senses. What happened? Did Daddy Moreau write you a nice little check?" "I hope he did. Word of advice, invest it wisely. It's not every day a dock worker's son gets that kind of payout." Oliver kept walking, his jaw tight. "You're pathetic, Sebastian. You've been chasing Elliot for years, and he's always chosen me. Even now, he chooses me. He's marrying Damian Sterling, a man who's not you." Sebastian's face flushed an ugly red. "And you think you're better than me? You're nothing, Oliver. A nobody from nowhere. Elliot was just using you for a while, playing out some fantasy about dating the help. But in the end, he came back to his own kind. That's what matters." Oliver stopped walking and turned to face him. The Omega in him was rising, his scent turning dark and dangerous. He'd spent 3 years swallowing the insults from people like Sebastian, keeping his head down and proving himself through his work. But he was done. There was nothing left to lose anymore. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and threatening. I don't care about you. I don't care about your money or your connections or your pathetic little obsession with Elliot. All I care about is getting out of this hotel before I do something we'll both regret. So step aside. Sebastian laughed, but it was nervous now. You think you can threaten me? Me? My family has more lawyers than you have brain cells. One word from me, and you'll be scrubbing toilets in a hospital basement for the rest of your career. Is that a threat? Oliver asked, his voice dangerously soft. It's a promise. Sebastian stepped closer, his sense spiking with aggression. You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. And when Elliot's married to Damien and running the Sterling dynasty, he'll forget you ever existed. The words hit Oliver like a physical blow, and he felt something inside him snap. He'd been holding it together through sheer willpower, but Sebastian's cruelty was the final straw. His Omega instincts might have been screaming at him to flee, but the human part of him, the part that had survived poverty and prejudice and every obstacle life had thrown at him, finally found an outlet. Before he knew what he was doing, Oliver's fist connected with Sebastian's jaw. The sound of the impact echoed through the lobby. Sebastian went down hard, his expensive suit crumpling on the marble floor. Oliver stood over him, breathing heavily, his hands shaking with adrenaline and fury. Oliver. A familiar voice cut through the chaos. Oliver, stop. He looked up to see Elliot running toward him, his expression a mix of horror and something that looked almost like relief. Behind him, Damien Sterling was walking with measured calm, his handsome face unreadable. Sebastian, Elliot said, kneeling down to help the other Alfie up. What did you do? Me? Sebastian spat, blood dripping from his split lip. Your psychopath ex attacked me for no reason. I want him arrested. You want to be quiet. Elliot's voice was ice cold, and there was something in his tone that made even Oliver shiver. I know exactly what you said to him. I've known you for 20 years, Sebastian. I know how you operate. You provoked him. You took advantage of his vulnerability. And now you're paying the consequences. Elliot, go home. Elliot's voice left no room for argument. Have your lawyer call mine if you want to press charges. But I guarantee you, it won't end well for you. My family might not approve of Oliver, but they approve of you even less. You've been trying to buy your way into the Moreau fortune for years. One scandal, and your father will cut you off completely. Sebastian's face went pale. He looked between Elliot and Oliver, his eyes burning with hatred, then turned and stalked out of the lobby without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. Oliver could feel the stares of the other patrons on his back, could hear the whispered speculations. He'd just made a scene in one of Ashford's most exclusive hotels. His reputation would never recover. You didn't have to do that, he said to Elliot, his voice flat. I could have handled it. I know. Elliot's voice was quiet, hesitant. I know you could have. But I didn't want you to have to. He paused, his eyes searching Oliver's face. Are you okay? Oliver laughed, and it came out bitter. I'm fine. I'm always fine. He turned to leave again, but Elliot caught his arm. Oliver, wait. Please. Don't go like this. What do you want from me? Oliver asked, pulling away from the alpha's touch. You made your choice. You're marrying someone else. You have no right to ask me anything. I know. Elliot's voice was barely a whisper. I know I don't have the right. But I can't just let you walk away thinking. Thinking what? Oliver spun to face him. Thinking that you actually wanted this. That you didn't have a choice? That if things were different, you'd still choose me? Yes. The word came out before Elliot could stop it. His eyes filled with tears again. Yes, Oliver. That's exactly what I want you to think. Because it's true. It's all true. I'm not doing this because I want to. I'm doing it because I have to. And if there's ever a chance, there will never be a chance. Oliver's voice was flat. You made sure of that when you signed that agreement. When you let your family sell you off like property. I'm done, Elliot. I'm done hoping, done waiting, done fighting for someone who won't fight for me. Oliver, goodbye, Elliot. I hope he makes you happy. This time, Oliver didn't stop walking. He pushed through the hotel's revolving doors and out into the Ashford night, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. He walked for blocks without knowing where he was going, his mind numb with grief and anger. The city hummed around him, indifferent to his pain, and he felt more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. Eventually, he found himself in front of Ashford General. The hospital had always been his sanctuary, the one place where he felt like he mattered, where his skills made a difference, where he wasn't judged by his background or his designation. He pushed through the emergency room doors and headed for the locker room. Oliver, Marcus was still there, reviewing charts at the station. The older alpha took one look at his face and immediately abandoned his work. "Hey, what happened? You look like you've been through a war." Something like that. Oliver slumped onto a chair, suddenly exhausted. Elliot called off the engagement. He's marrying Damien Sterling instead. Marcus's face went tight. The Sterling heir? The old money family? That's not just a political match, that's a dynasty. I know. Oliver's voice was hollow. His family needed a merger. They're in financial trouble. Elliot's father sold him to the highest bidder, and Elliot, he broke off, unable to continue. Elliot what? Marcus prompted gently. He went along with it. Oliver's voice cracked on the words. He told me he loved me, and then he handed me a check and told me to move on. He didn't even try to fight. He just gave up. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then moved to put a hand on Oliver's shoulder. I'm sorry, kid. I know how much he meant to you. I thought he was the one, Oliver said, his voice barely a whisper. I thought we were going to get married and have a life together. I was going to accept his proposal next week. He had the ring and everything. The ring. Marcus frowned. Elliot was going to propose? With what ring? Oliver shook his head. It doesn't matter now. None of it matters. 3 weeks passed. Oliver threw himself into his work with a desperation that bordered on self-destruction. He took every extra shift, volunteered for every complicated surgery, worked until his hands shook and his vision blurred. He didn't want to think. He didn't want to feel. He just wanted to save lives and forget that his own life had been shattered. Oliver, you look like hell, Marcus said one morning, finding him in the break room. The older alpha was gruff but kind, and he'd been watching Oliver with increasing concern. When's the last time you slept? 8. Did anything other than this? I'm fine. Oliver didn't look up from the chart he was reviewing. Busy schedule. You know how it is. I know how it is, Marcus agreed. I also know that your alpha, the one you were going to marry, just got engaged to someone else. So maybe don't tell me you're fine. Oliver's pen stilled. He's not my alpha. He never was. Bullshit. Marcus's voice was gentle. I've seen you with him. That was real, Oliver. Whatever happened in his head, whatever his family said to him, that connection was real. You can't just pretend it wasn't. I can try, Oliver said quietly. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Every shift, he caught himself looking up when a familiar scent entered the room. Every patient with broad shoulders and dark hair made his heart stutter. Every time his phone buzzed, he still hoped it was Elliot, calling to apologize, to take it all back. It never was. The day everything changed started like any other. Oliver was in the middle of a 36-hour shift, running on coffee and pure stubbornness, when the code blue came through. He'd been in the middle of stitching a teenager's laceration, but Marcus had shoved him aside and told him to handle the emergency personally. Oliver, you're the best trauma surgeon we have, Marcus had said. And the patient coming in is a VIP. We need you. The VIP turned out to be Damien Sterling himself. Oliver had never met the man, but he'd heard the stories. Damien Sterling was the adopted heir to the Sterling family, the alpha who'd built the Sterling Financial Group into a global powerhouse. He was also Ashford's most eligible bachelor, a man whose profile was never far from the society pages. And, Oliver thought bitterly, the man who was about to marry the love of his life. What Oliver hadn't expected was to see Elliot standing in the waiting room as they rushed the gurney past. Oliver. Elliot's face was pale, his scent sharp with distress. Wait, Oliver. You can't. That's Damien. You need to. I know who it is. Oliver didn't slow down. I need to work. You need to stay here. But, stay here, Oliver said, and the command in his voice made Elliot stop in his tracks. He caught the alpha's eye for just a moment, saw the flash of hurt there, and then he was moving again, headed into surgery. The next 4 hours were a blur of precision and instinct. Damien had been poisoned, something rare and fast-acting, already moving through his system by the time he'd been brought in. The toxicology report showed a synthetic compound designed to mimic a heart attack, virtually undetectable unless you knew exactly what to look for. Oliver made a call that everyone thought was crazy. Direct blood transfusion from the patient's fiancé, the only viable donor with matching rare antigen patterns. Who is it? Someone asked. Oliver glanced at the waiting room through the window. His fiancé, apparently. The staff exchanged looks. Damien Sterling's engagement to Elliot Moreau had been announced just the week before. A marriage of two great families, the papers had called it. A perfect union. Oliver pushed the thought aside and focused on his patient. The procedure was brutal. Direct transfusion was a controversial technique. Dangerous, unpredictable, and only effective if the surgeon knew exactly what they were doing. But Oliver had studied it extensively, had learned the ancient pressure point techniques from an elderly mentor who'd spent decades in remote regions studying traditional medicine. Those techniques, combined with modern surgical knowledge, made Oliver one of the few surgeons in the world who could perform the procedure safely. Hour after hour passed. Elliot lay on the adjacent gurney, his lifeblood flowing into Damien's failing body. Oliver could see the alpha growing weaker, his scent fading, his skin turning pale. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. For all his personal feelings, Oliver was a doctor first. He'd sworn an oath to save lives, regardless of who those lives belonged to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Oliver stepped back from the gurney. Transfusion complete, he announced, his voice hoarse. Monitor his vitals closely. If there's any change, call me immediately. The other doctors rushed forward, and Oliver stumbled back from the table. He was exhausted, his body trembling with adrenaline and fatigue. He'd been running on empty for hours, pushing himself past his limits. Oliver. Elliot's voice was weak, but there was something desperate in it. Please. I need to talk to you. Not now. Oliver couldn't face him. Not after everything. I need to rest. We'll talk later. I won't accept later. Elliot struggled to sit up, despite the nurses trying to restrain him. I need to tell you the truth. I need to explain. There's nothing to explain. Oliver's voice came out harsher than he intended. You chose him. You signed the agreement. You ended us. There's nothing left to say. Oliver, please. Let him rest. Marcus intervened, stepping between them. He just performed a miracle. Give him time to recover. Elliot's eyes found Oliver's, and in them was a world of hurt and desperation. I'll be waiting, he said quietly. Whenever you're ready. I'll be here. Oliver turned and walked away. Damien Sterling woke 3 days later, pale but stable. His first words were a request to see his surgeon. Oliver entered the private room with his shoulders squared and his face carefully neutral. The alpha in the bed was impressive. Even weakened, Damien Sterling had a presence that commanded attention. He was handsome in a sleek, powerful way, the kind of alpha who'd never had to ask twice for anything in his life. Dr. Hart, Damien said, his voice raspy but clear. I owe you my life. Whatever you want, money, position, anything, it's yours. I don't want anything. Oliver's voice was flat. I did my job. That's enough. Damien studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes. You don't like me. I don't know you. Oliver shrugged. I don't have feelings either way. Liar. Damien smiled, but there was no malice in it. You hate me. I can smell it on you. You're the ex, aren't you? The Omega Elliot was in love with before his father forced the engagement. Oliver's jaw tightened. That's none of my business anymore. It is my business. Damien was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Elliot talked about you constantly in the hospital. When he wasn't asleep, he was asking about you, begging to see you, crying your name in his sleep. He paused. I've never seen a man that broken over someone he was supposed to have moved on from. Your point? My point is that I'm not in the habit of keeping people against their will. Damien's voice was calm, measured. I agreed to this marriage because it was good business. But I'm not interested in a partner who's in love with someone else. That's not a marriage. That's a hostage situation. Oliver stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm ending the engagement. Damien's voice was firm. I'll still invest in the Moreau company. I'm a businessman, not a monster, but I won't force Elliot into a life he doesn't want. He deserves better than that. Oliver felt his carefully constructed walls starting to crack. You're giving him up? Just like that. I'm giving him a choice. Damien's eyes met his. What he does with that choice is up to him. But I have a feeling I already know what he'll choose. The news broke the next morning. The Sterling Moreau engagement was off, and the gossip columns went into a frenzy. Oliver ignored all of it, focusing on his patients, his surgeries, his work. But on the third day after the announcement, Elliot found him. Oliver was in the hospital garden, sitting on a stone bench surrounded by autumn flowers. The alpha's scent was muted, but Oliver could smell the anxiety beneath the suppressants. He looked thinner than he had before, shadows under his eyes telling the story of sleepless nights. You've been avoiding me, Elliot said, not looking up. I've been working. Same thing. Elliot finally raised his eyes, and Oliver felt his breath catch at the pain in them. Damien told you about the engagement. He told me he ended it. He told you the truth. Elliot's voice was quiet, steady. He told you that I never wanted it. That I was doing it for my family. That I was. He broke off, taking a shaky breath. I was miserable, Oliver. The day I broke things off with you, I went home and cried for hours. I've been crying ever since. Oliver moved closer, his Omega instincts screaming at him to comfort the Alpha. Elliot. I know I don't deserve another chance, Elliot continued, his voice cracking. I know I hurt you. I know I was cowardly and selfish and... He laughed, a broken sound. My father told me I was doing the right thing. My mother told me I was doing the right thing. Everyone in my life told me I was doing the right thing, and I believed them. I was so scared, Oliver. I was so scared of what would happen if I didn't do what they wanted. You're scared now, Oliver said quietly. I can smell it. Elliot nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm terrified. I'm terrified that you'll tell me to leave. That you'll say you've moved on. That I've lost you forever. He stood, taking a step toward Oliver. But I had to try. I had to tell you the truth. That I love you. That I've always loved you. That I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn your forgiveness if you let me. Oliver stood there, frozen, his heart at war with his head. 3 years of love, months of grief, weeks of trying to move on, and now this. The chance to have everything he'd ever wanted, if he could just let go of the anger. But something was different now. The despair that had consumed him after the breakup had hardened into something else. A clarity he hadn't had before. He'd spent 3 weeks hurting, crying, wondering what he'd done wrong. And he'd realized something. He hadn't done anything wrong. Elliot had made his choice. The fact that he'd changed his mind didn't erase the fact that he'd chosen to throw Oliver away like garbage. You hurt me, Oliver said finally, his voice rough. You hurt me more than I thought anyone ever could. I know. Elliot's voice was barely a whisper. You made me feel worthless. Like everything we'd built together meant nothing. Oliver, let me finish. Oliver stepped closer, his eyes locked on Elliot's. You made me feel like I wasn't enough. Like no matter what I did, I could never be what you needed. And that, he broke off, his own eyes filling with tears. That broke something in me. Something I'm not sure can be fixed. Elliot's face crumpled, and he reached out for Oliver. But Oliver stepped back. I thought about it. Oliver continued, his voice steadier now. I thought about forgiving you, about giving us another chance. But then I realized something. If you'd really loved me, you would have fought for me. You would have stood up to your father. You wouldn't have handed me a check and told me to move on. I was trying to protect you. Protect me. Oliver laughed, and it came out bitter. You didn't protect me. You humiliated me. You made me feel like I was nothing. And I'm not going to let you do that to me again. Elliot's face went pale. Oliver, please. I'm done. Oliver's voice was final. I'm done hoping, done waiting, done fighting for someone who won't fight for me. You made your choice, Elliot. You chose your family. You chose their money. You chose their approval. And I have to accept that. But I'm choosing you now. You're choosing me because Damien gave you permission. Oliver shook his head. If he hadn't ended things, you'd still be planning your wedding to him. You didn't come back to me because you realized you loved me. You came back because your other option fell through. That's not true, isn't it? Oliver's voice was weary. Prove me wrong. Show me that you would have fought for me even if Damien hadn't let you go. But we both know you wouldn't have. You were too scared. And I can't spend my life with someone who only finds his courage when there's no other choice. Elliot was crying openly now, his alpha composure shattered. Oliver, I love you. I've always loved you. Please don't. I loved you too, Oliver said, and his voice softened for just a moment. I loved you with everything I had. But love isn't enough. You taught me that. So I'm going to take what you taught me and build a better life for myself. A life where I'm not waiting for someone to choose me. He turned and walked away, his steps steady despite the tears streaming down his face. Behind him, he heard Elliot's broken sobs, heard him calling Oliver's name over and over again. But Oliver didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because if he stopped, he'd turn around, and if he turned around, he'd be lost forever. The walk through the hospital felt like a dream. Oliver was aware of his surroundings but disconnected from them. The white walls, the antiseptic smell, the distant beeping of monitors. He passed nurses and doctors who called out greetings, but he didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the painful clarity that had finally come. He'd done the right thing. He knew that with a certainty that surprised him. Walking away from Elliot hurt. God, it hurt so much. But staying would have hurt worse in the long run. He needed time to heal. He needed space to rebuild himself. And the only way to do that was to let go completely. Marcus found him in the supply closet, sitting on a box of bandages with his face in his hands. The older alpha didn't say anything, just sat down beside him and waited. He came back. Oliver finally said, his voice muffled. He said he loved me. He wanted another chance. And what did you say? I said no. Oliver looked up, his eyes red but dry. I told him I was done. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Good. Good. Oliver blinked. I thought you wanted us to get back together. I wanted you to be happy, Marcus corrected. And I didn't think you could be happy without him. But seeing you now, you're different. Stronger. You made a decision that was best for you, not for him. That's growth, Oliver. That's healing. Oliver let out a shaky breath. It doesn't feel like healing. It feels like dying. I know. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. But it gets better. I promise. The night of the South City Orphanage fundraiser arrived 3 weeks later. Oliver hadn't planned to attend. He'd never been part of Ashford's elite social scene, and he certainly wasn't in the mood for champagne and small talk. But Marcus had insisted. You need to get out, the older alpha had said. You've been hiding in that apartment for weeks. It's not good for you. I'm not hiding. I'm working. You're hiding in plain sight. Marcus's voice was firm. The fundraiser is for a good cause. Go. Be seen. Show everyone that you're still standing, even after everything that happened. Oliver had finally relented. He'd bought a new suit. Nothing flashy, but well-tailored and expensive enough to show that he wasn't crumbling. His Omega instincts had been quiet lately, dulled by grief and exhaustion, but as he walked into the glittering ballroom, he felt something stir. The South City Orphanage fundraiser was the event of the season. Ashford's elite had turned out in force, their jewels sparkling under the chandeliers, their voices a low hum of polite conversation. Oliver moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting the occasional nod but avoiding real conversation. He didn't want to be there. He wanted to be home, in his small apartment, with his books and his memories and his pain. But Marcus was right. He couldn't hide forever. Oliver Hart. The voice cut through the noise like a knife. Oliver turned to see Sebastian Vance approaching, his alpha scent sharp with triumph. The bruise on his jaw had faded, but his hatred for Oliver was as fresh as ever. "Sebastian," Oliver said flatly, "I don't have time for your games tonight." "Games?" Sebastian laughed, loud enough to draw attention from the surrounding guests. "Who said anything about games? I'm just surprised to see you here. I didn't think the hospital janitorial staff got invitations to events like this." Oliver's jaw tightened. "Funny, I'm serious." Sebastian stepped closer, his voice carrying to the small crowd that had gathered. "Tell me, Oliver, how does it feel? Elliot chose Damien Sterling over you. He chose money and power and everything you can't give him. And now you're here, pretending you belong, when everyone knows you're nothing." The words hit their mark. Oliver felt the eyes of the crowd on him, heard the whispered speculation. He was alone in a room full of people who saw him as a charity case, a beggar who tried to marry above his station and been rightfully put in his place. "Say what you want," Oliver said, his voice steady despite the burning in his chest. "I don't care what you think of me." "Oh, I know you don't." Sebastian's smile was cruel. "Because you're too stupid to care. You're a nobody, Oliver. A nobody from nowhere. And no matter what you do, you'll never be anything else." The silence that followed was absolute. Oliver felt his Omega instincts screaming at him to run, to hide, to protect himself from the Alpha's aggression. But he held his ground. "This is your fault, Oliver." Elliot had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face twisted with rage. "You couldn't just let go and move on. You had to crawl back and ruin everything for everyone." Oliver stared at him, disbelief washing over him. "You broke my heart. I've moved on. I've been doing everything I can to stay away from you and this family. What more could you possibly want? You should have done more." Elliot shouted, and there was something desperate in his voice. "If you just disappeared, I could have made peace with the decision. I could have been happy with Damien. But no, you had to stick around. Make me feel guilty. Make me remember everything we had." Oliver laughed, and it was the ugliest sound he'd ever made. "That's what you're angry about? That I made you feel guilty for treating me like garbage?" "I never treated you like garbage." $2 million. Oliver's voice rang out across the ballroom. "You gave me $2 million to go away. You told me I wasn't good enough for you. You let your father call me trash. And now you're standing here, in front of everyone, trying to make me the villain." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Oliver could see the cameras of the press, the professional photographers who covered Ashford's elite for a living. And he knew that this moment would be splashed across every tabloid the next day. He didn't care anymore. "If you've ever had any shred of dignity, Dr. Hart," Sebastian's voice was laced with contempt, "you'd walk out that door and never come back. Elliot is going to marry Damien Sterling, and they're both too good for the likes of you." Oliver felt his carefully constructed composure finally crack. "You think I care about your opinion? You think I care what any of you think? I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't good enough. But at least I've never been so pathetic that I had to tear someone else down to feel powerful." Sebastian lunged. Oliver didn't see the punch coming. His Omega reflexes were too slow, too weary. The blow caught him on the jaw, and he hit the floor hard, the polished marble cold against his cheek. For a moment, everything was chaos. Then Oliver felt a hand on his arm, pulling him up. "Get up," a voice said. Low, commanding. "Alpha." Oliver looked up into the face of Damien Sterling. The Alpha's expression was hard as stone, his scent sharp with barely contained anger. But when he looked at Oliver, something in his eyes softened. "Are you hurt?" Damien asked, his voice pitched low for Oliver's ears only. "I'm fine," Oliver said, his jaw throbbing. "I can take care of myself." "I know you can." Damien released him carefully. "But you don't have to. Not here. Not tonight." Sebastian was being held back by two security guards, his face twisted with rage. Elliot stood frozen nearby, his expression a mask of conflicting emotions. "This is a private event," Damien said, turning to face the crowd. "But it's being held on Sterling property, and anyone who attacks my guests will face legal consequences." "The guests?" Sebastian spat. "This nobody isn't your guest. He's a charity case." Dr. Hart is my guest. Damien cut him off, his voice cold. He's also the man who saved my life. And I won't tolerate anyone insulting him in my presence. The crowd went quiet. Oliver felt the weight of their stares shift, from pity and contempt to something closer to respect. Being openly defended by a man like Damien Sterling was a powerful statement, and everyone in the room knew it. "Miss," one of the photographers called out, "is there any truth to the rumors about Dr. Hart stealing the King's Heart diamond?" "The King's Heart." Another voice joined in. "The legendary diamond from Sterling Jewelers? The one worth $50 million. Oliver froze. He'd heard the rumors, of course, everyone had. After his breakup with Elliot, Sebastian had spread stories about Oliver stealing from the Sterling collection to fund his lifestyle. The accusations had been unspoken, but persistent. "Dr. Hart didn't steal the King's Heart," Damien said, his voice firm. "Because I gave it to him." The silence that followed was so absolute that Oliver could hear the distant sound of traffic outside. "You what?" Sebastian's voice was a strangled gasp. "I gave it to him." Damien's expression was unreadable. "As a gift. For saving my life. He didn't want it, but I insisted." "You gave a $50 million diamond to him?" "Yes." Damien's voice was flat. "And I'd do it again." In fact, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I'd like to present it to him now, publicly, so that everyone knows exactly who owns it." Damien handed him the box. Oliver stared at it, his heart racing. "I don't understand." "Open it," Damien urged. Oliver's hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, a diamond sat nestled in black velvet. It was more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen, more valuable than he could ever imagine. And then he saw it, the inscription on the inside of the box. A name. Oliver's own name. Before he could process this, Elliot had pushed forward, his eyes wide and desperate. "Oliver, I can explain." "Don't," Oliver said coldly. "I don't want to hear any explanations." "Then maybe you'll listen to mine." The voice that cut through the uproar came from the entrance. "There are things you need to know, Oliver. About yourself. About your family." Everyone in the room turned to see an elegant older man approaching. His silver hair was impeccably combed, his suit was perfectly tailored, and his bearing radiated wealth and power. But there was something else in his expression, a warmth and recognition that made Oliver's breath catch. "Who are you?" Oliver demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. "What do you want with me?" "My name is Charles Beaufort," the old alpha said, his voice resonant but kind. "And I am your grandfather. Your real grandfather. The one who searched for you for 3 decades after your mother ran away from home." Oliver stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the words. "That's not possible. My mother told you she was a widow, I know." Charles's expression was pained. "She ran away from our family because she hated the constraints of our world. She married a man who had nothing, and she was happy for a time. But then your father died, and she was left alone with you. She thought she was protecting you by keeping you away from us. And she was wrong." Oliver felt the world tilt around him. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say that you are a Beaufort." Charles's voice was firm but gentle. "The Beaufort family is one of the oldest and wealthiest in the world. We control assets worth $3 trillion. And you, Oliver, are our sole heir." The silence was absolute. Oliver felt his throat close as he looked at the man who claimed to be his grandfather, then out at the crowd of stunned socialites, all of whom now stared at him with a mixture of shock and greed. "This is a prank," someone in the crowd whispered. "He's working with them." But Oliver saw the look in Charles's eyes, and he knew that this wasn't a trick. This was the truth. $3 trillion, Oliver repeated, his voice hollow. "And you're telling me that for the last 3 years, I was nothing but a poor, pathetic omega who couldn't even keep his alpha?" "You never told me," Elliot said, his voice raw with pain. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because it didn't matter," Oliver said flatly. "I didn't want to be rich because of my family. I wanted to be loved because of me. But now I realize it never mattered how much I had. You would have left me anyway, Because the problem wasn't my bank account. It was your heart. Oliver looked around the room. All of you looked down on me for 3 years. And now you know I have more money than all of you combined. Does that change what I am? Or does it just change what you see? Nobody answered. I've had enough, Oliver said quietly, turning his back on the crowd. Enough of pretending to be something I'm not. Enough of hoping for acceptance from people who will never give it. It's time for me to be who I really am. And if that's not good enough for any of you, then so be it. But Oliver, Elliot tried. No. Oliver cut him off, his voice flat. You had your chance. You chose money and status over what we had. And now you'll have to live with that choice. As Oliver was leaving, Elliot caught his arm. Please, the alpha begged. Just listen. I made a mistake. I was scared. And I was heartbroken, Oliver said quietly. I had to pick up the pieces of myself alone. I had to learn to live without you. And now that I've finally started healing, you come back to me with a check in your hand and a sob story in your voice? It's too late, Elliot. You broke my heart, and I've finally accepted that it's never going to be whole again. Elliot's face contorted with pain. I didn't know who you were. If I'd known. What? Oliver laughed, and it was the ugliest sound he'd ever made. If you'd known I was a Beaufort, you would have stayed? You would have loved me for my money instead of my heart. That's supposed to make me feel better? I never said that. Your own father disowned you the moment you broke the engagement, Oliver said coldly. But here you are, trying to crawl back to me now that you know I have everything you'll ever need. I'm sorry, Elliot, but I'm not your redemption. I'm not your backup plan. And I'm done standing in the shadow of someone who only loved me when it was convenient. Elliot opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. Oliver had spoken the truth. Come on, Oliver, Charles Beaufort said gently, taking his grandson's arm. Let's get out of here. Oliver nodded. He let himself be led away from the ballroom, away from the stunned silence, away from the life he'd thought he wanted, straight into the future he'd never known he'd have. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. Oliver stood at the top of the steps, his breath misting in the cold, and let his grandfather's words sink in. $3 trillion, he said again, the number feeling surreal on his tongue. I could buy anything in the world. You could, his grandfather agreed quietly. The question is, will you let it control you? Or will you use it to become something more? Oliver thought about it. He thought about all the years he'd struggled, all the sacrifices he'd made, all the people who'd looked down on him for who he was. He could have had all of this. He'd walked away from it. If I'd known about you, he said slowly, I wouldn't have stayed with him. I would have left the moment I realized he loved the idea of my family more than he loved me. Because that's the truth, isn't it? That's what love means. Not the fantasy of who you are, but the reality of who you are. Charles nodded. You're a good man, Oliver. You always have been. And you'll make a fine heir. Oliver looked back at the hotel. He could see the silhouette of Elliot at the window, could feel the alpha's eyes on him even from this distance. But he didn't feel anything anymore. No grief, no longing. Just a quiet sense of closure. Take me home, Oliver said. I think I need to figure out exactly who I am before I decide what I'm going to do with it. I'll be happy to show you, Charles said. In time. But you're right. You need to come to terms with your inheritance on your own terms. Oliver let himself be led to the car. The ride was a blur of city lights and silence. A moment to process everything that had happened in the span of a single night. The next morning, Oliver woke up in his own apartment. The same cramped space he'd lived in for years, now feeling impossibly small. He lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and tried to wrap his mind around what had happened. He was a Beaufort. He'd been a Beaufort all along, and nobody had known. Not even him. The irony was almost too much to bear. He'd spent years fighting to be seen as something more than a poor doctor, only to discover that he'd been one of the richest men in the world the entire time. His grandfather had arranged for the transfer of his assets the next day. Oliver sat in the Beaufort family lawyer's office, a mountain of documents in front of him, and tried to feel something. Excitement, gratitude, anything. But all he felt was tired. You don't have to sign anything today, Charles said gently. This is a lot to process. Oliver looked up at him. When I was poor, I thought money would solve everything. Now I have more than I could ever spend, and I feel nothing. What does that say about me? It says you're a good man. Charles's voice was firm. You didn't want this for the power. You wanted it for the security, the freedom to live your life on your terms. And now you have it. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the pen and signed the first document. I want to donate half of it to the hospital, he said quietly, to fund research for rare diseases. And I want to set up a fund for the orphanage, the one that held the fundraiser. I want them to have everything they need. Charles looked at him with something close to pride. That's a generous thing to do, Oliver. I don't need all of it, Oliver said. I never needed it. But maybe I can use it to help people who did. He signed the rest of the documents without hesitation. Then he walked out of the office and into the sun, feeling lighter than he had in years. 3 months passed. Oliver had settled into his new life with surprising ease. He'd stopped practicing medicine, for now, at least, and was instead devoting his time to charity work. The South City orphanage was thriving thanks to his donations, and the hospital had been able to expand its rare disease research unit. His grandfather had proven to be a kind and patient guide, introducing him to the family's business empire without overwhelming him. Oliver was learning, slowly but surely, how to manage the vast fortune that had fallen into his lap. He still thought about Elliot sometimes, not with longing, but with the distant ache of a wound that had finally healed. He'd seen the Alpha a few times, mostly in the society pages where Elliot had become a fixture. The heartbreaking Omega who'd made a terrible mistake was the caption, accompanied by photographs of Elliot looking broken and vulnerable. If Elliot had been anyone else, Oliver might have felt sorry for him. But he'd made his choice, and Oliver had made his. Damien Sterling had become a surprising ally, if not a friend. The Alpha had gone out of his way to make his position clear, and had even arranged a few meetings between Oliver and his grandfather's business partners. There was something in the Alpha's eyes when he looked at Oliver, not pity, but genuine respect. Damien, Oliver said one afternoon, when the Alpha had stopped by his office. I need to ask you something. Anything, Damien said. Why did you give me the king's heart? Oliver asked. You barely knew me. I just saved your life. It wasn't a gift, it was a test. Damien smiled. You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for. You're right, it was a test. I wanted to see what kind of man you were. And you passed. Oliver stared at him. I passed. You didn't keep the diamond, Damien said simply. You gave it back. You didn't even consider keeping it, not once. That's rare in someone who's struggled as much as you have. That's why I know you're going to be a good person, Oliver. No matter how much money you have. Oliver laughed, but it was a gentle sound. I appreciate the vote of confidence. He was on his way out of the building when he saw Elliot. The Alpha stood by the street, looking pale and drawn. His Alpha scent was muted, but Oliver could smell the distress beneath it. He looked thinner than he had before, shadows under his eyes telling the story of sleepless nights. Oliver. Elliot's voice was raw. Please. I need to talk to you. Oliver stopped walking. His heart was steady. That surprised him too. He thought he'd feel something, even if it was just bitterness. I'm not sure there's anything left to say, Oliver said quietly. I think we said everything we needed to say that night. Please. Elliot stepped closer, his eyes searching. Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I need. Oliver hesitated. He knew he should walk away. He knew he should leave this in the past where it belonged. But something in Elliot's expression made him pause. The Alpha looked shattered, broken in a way Oliver had never seen before. 5 minutes, Oliver said. Elliot nodded, relief flooding his features. Thank you. They walked to a nearby park, a quiet space away from the noise of the city. Oliver sat on a stone bench and waited for Elliot to find his voice. I know I don't deserve another chance, Elliot said finally. I know I hurt you more than anyone ever should, and I know that saying I'm sorry will never be enough. Oliver remained silent. But I need you to understand something. Elliot continued, his voice thick with emotion. I made a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. And I've been living with the consequences of that mistake every single day. You were right. I was a coward. I should have fought for you. I should have stood up to my father. And I didn't. And that's something I'm going to have to live with for the rest of my life. Oliver felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, exactly. More like acceptance. Elliot, he said gently. I know you were scared. I know you were doing what you thought was right. But that doesn't change what happened. You left me. You chose someone else. And now you have to live with that choice. I know. Elliot's voice broke. I know I can't take it back. But I want you to know that I loved you. I still love you. And I'll always regret letting you go. Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took Elliot's hand. I don't hate you, he said quietly. I don't even hate you for what you did. You were scared, and scared people do stupid things. But I'm not in love with you anymore, Elliot. That part of me died when you walked away. Elliot's face crumpled. Oliver, I'm grateful for what we had. Oliver continued. I'll always remember the good times. But I need you to let me go. I need you to understand that I'm not the same person I was when you left me. I've grown. I've changed. And the person I am now doesn't need you anymore. Elliot stared at him, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. I know, Oliver said. And someday, I hope you forgive yourself. But I can't be the one to help you do that. That's something you need to find on your own. He stood up and walked away, his steps steady and sure. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see Elliot's face. But he knew, deep in his heart, that he'd finally closed the chapter he'd been trying to close for so long. A month later, Oliver stood at the entrance of the new Beaufort family philanthropy headquarters, watching the crowd gather for the grand opening. The building was sleek and modern, a testament to his grandfather's vision and his own commitment to giving back. Damien Sterling arrived early, as usual, and stood beside Oliver during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. You've come a long way, Damien said quietly. I'm proud of you. Thank you. Oliver smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. I couldn't have done it without your help. You could have, Damien said. But I'm glad I was here to see it. As the crowd began to disperse, Oliver spotted a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. Elliot was there, watching him with a mixture of longing and resignation. Oliver met his eyes for a moment. Then he looked away, and he felt nothing but peace. He'd given Elliot his forgiveness. But that was all he could give. Because this was where he belonged now. Not in the past, but in the present. Not as the Omega who'd been discarded, but as the man who'd risen from the ashes. He was a Beaufort. He was a doctor. He was a survivor. And he was finally, completely free. The music swelled around him, and the world felt right for the first time in a long time. He'd come through the fire, survived the pain, and emerged stronger on the other side. And in the end, that was all that mattered.